All right, we're going to continue talking about Congress, and we're going to switch from Congress as a representative body to think about Congress as an institution. So what we want to do is look more at how Congress is organized, what the rules of each house, the Senate and the House of Representatives are, how is party leadership structured and what is the role of the party leaders, how are committees formed and who participates in the committees. And then we'll talk a little bit about how a bill becomes a law and how Congress people decide on what measures or what bills to support and what not to support. And then we'll mention a few other types of things or functions that Congress does. All right, just let me say a few things about the organization of Congress as an overview. Congress is organized by parties, so the party structure is very important to Congress. It's the parties that select the leaders of who's going to be the leader in the Senate and who are going to be the leadership in the House. They organize their members in terms of trying to rally members around a particular legislative bill to vote for that bill. They form committees. They control the floor in terms of what's going to be on the agenda or the program. And the party system, as well as these legislative rules that help define the order and events of how the day is going to be managed, all this is directed by the leadership from the parties. And so the committees create this division of labor, and we'll talk about the different committees momentarily. In general, we think of the Senate as being loosely organized and a very open form of discussion, while in the House the debate is highly organized and there's lots of rules that House members have to follow. And this is a function of the size of each of these chambers. Remember, the Senate only has 100 members, and so from its earliest days the Senate has been more informal, more collegial, more egalitarian, and each senator enjoys what is called a filibuster right, or the right of unlimited debate. And the purpose of a senator's filibuster is so that they can block a bill from coming to the floor for a vote. So they literally have an unlimited ability to block potential legislation. The longest filibuster was by Strom Thurmond, who spoke for over 24 hours in an attempt to thwart the passage of a 1957 Civil Rights Act. And so they literally would bring cots to the floor to be able to stay at the Senate 24 hours in order to make sure that they're talking for that entire period. In order to stop a senator from talking, it's called a cloture vote, C-L-O-T-U-R-E. It takes 3/5 of the Senate to end such a filibuster. All right, so let's think about this party leadership. In the Senate, again, which is loosely organized, you have a majority and a minority leader. In the House, which is much more organized and much more formal, you have a Speaker of the House. So there's different types of leadership on each side. And this leadership is the way that power is going to be distributed in Congress. Again, there's no single leader of Congress, so the House and the Senate have separate leaders. And neither of these leaders can presume to speak on behalf of the other chamber. All right, so let's look at the House for a moment in terms of party leadership. The leader of the House is called the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House comes from the majority party. So it's just called Speaker of the House. There's not a majority Speaker of the House. It's just Speaker of the House. And on the right of this photo is John Boehner. He's the current Speaker of the House. And whichever party is in the majority, they get to elect out of their members who's going to be the Speaker of the House. So when Republicans took over Congress in the last election in 2010, those members of Congress who are Republicans voted for John Boehner to be the Speaker of the House. On the left is the former Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, because when the Democrats controlled the House, she was the Speaker of the House. So the House has the Speaker, and the Speaker has the power to control legislation and the rules that are going to be set forth in the House. And this House elects the Speaker at the beginning of each new session. And so, in essence, the Speaker of the House is really the political leader of the majority party in the House of Representatives. And this particular role is a strong leadership role. He or she is the presiding officer and therefore controls floor debate. It's also a very prestigious position. Some would say number 2 to the president. In order of accession to the presidency, if something happens to the president, then the vice president, of course, assumes that responsibility. But if something happens to both the president and the vice president at the same time, if they were to, I don't know, spontaneously combust at the same time, then the Speaker of the House is third in line to the presidency. And Nancy Pelosi's ascension to the Speaker of the House was very important because she was the first woman to ever hold that position. All right, so those are the current leaders, all right? There's an additional leadership position within the House of Representatives. So you have the Speaker of the House who controls the whole House, but you also have the House Majority Leader. This is the Speaker's major communication link to the rest of the parties. And currently the House Majority Leader is, of course, a Republican. There's also a House Minority Leader, and this is the role of Nancy Pelosi today because, of course, she was the former Speaker, so now she is the Minority Leader because she is the leader of the minority party in the House, the Democrats. All right, in the Senate, you don't have a Speaker of the Senate. What you have in the Senate are 2 party leaders. You have the majority and the minority leaders. Unlike the House, where the Republicans are the dominant party, in the Senate, the Democrats have the majority, so the majority leader in the Senate is a Democrat, and that's Harry Reid, and he's pictured there on the right. The Senate Minority Leader is a Republican, and he's on the left, that's Mitch McConnell. So you might see these 2 individuals in the news on Sunday mornings or in the news about what's going on in the Senate. So the Senate Majority Leader is elected by that particular party's caucus at the beginning of each new Congress. That is every 2 years. And the power varies and depends on the person and what are the leader's skills of negotiation, persuasion, and census building. The Majority Leader has to bargain with their fellow party members and the Senate Minority Leader to set the agenda. So there's a lot of discussion between the Majority and the Minority Leader in order to get bills on the floor for discussion. The Senate Minority Leader, of course, is elected by the party that's in the minority, and he speaks for the minority party for the most part, but he has really little control over all of the senators who are in the minority. But his job is to negotiate with the Majority Leader on the agenda and on the debate. There's one other leadership role. It's called the President Pro Tem of the Senate, and it's largely an honorary position, and it goes to the most senior member of the majority party. And he basically has a housekeeping job. He keeps things running smoothly. All right, the Vice President of the United States is also someone that appears in the Senate, and he's the presiding officer but rarely presides except to break a tie. And this is basically a formality. Now, individual party members can choose to follow or ignore their leader's requests when it comes to voting on bills. So one thing to write down and remember, it's not on the slide, is that party structure, parties in America are weak and decentralized. We'll talk a lot more about parties toward the end of the semester, but we don't have a strong party system. Members of the different parties vote outside of their parties a lot in terms of legislation. So you see Democrats voting for Republican initiatives, and you see Republicans voting for things that the Democrats want. So the federal system and this weakness of party organization really encourages members of Congress to focus on local interests in order to promote their reelection prospects. And so there are times when if you have a Republican House member, for example, who lives in a moderate district, he may vote many times on what Democrats want. Conversely, if you have a Democrat that lives in a somewhat conservative district, he might vote often with what Republicans want in order to satisfy the local interests. All right. Well, once these party leaders are established, then they can assign committees to the different members of each house. So in 1789, the first session of Congress was composed of only 65 members and 26 senators, so it was much smaller, of course. In both the House and the Senate, members made most of their important decisions after open discussions among the members on the floor, and they appointed committees only for specific tasks and did not really trust the secrecy of committees that we see today. And the empowered leaders were only there to guide and monitor debate. However, over time, and as the workload grew and as the number of members grew, each chamber was forced to develop a system to organize the members and better manage the workload. Because the size of the House grew much more rapidly than the Senate, the House depends more upon that formal structure that I talked about. They have to have strong leadership. They have to have strong internal organization. They have to adhere to rules or to procedures, because otherwise you would just have chaos and anarchy in the House. So if you're a member of any type of committee structure or an organization where you're a member of committee, you know that the bigger the number of people in your organization, the more committees you're going to have because you have so much more work to accomplish. So fundamentally, the House operates by close enforcement of the rules, while the Senate is much more laid back and operates more by consensus. There are different types of things that are going on in the committees, and there's different norms of behavior for committees. And one of these norms is that there's a division of labor. That's why we have the committee system. One particular House member cannot be expected to know about every single or be an expert on every single issue. So they're going to be assigned to committees that mean something to the constituents. So if you're living along the Gulf Coast, for example, your interests and your constituency interests are very different than if you're from Iowa. So if you're from Iowa, you might want to be on the Agricultural Committee. If you're on the coast, you might be on some other committee dealing with environmental issues, for example. So there's really a specialization about Congress and Congress members. Members of Congress are expected to specialize and become experts in a field. You may recall that when Barack Obama was a senator, he really wanted to get on the Foreign Affairs Committee and learn more about foreign policy, and so that's an area that he wanted to become an expert in. And most subject matter areas in Congress are dominated by a few members who understand that process, know the issue inside and out, and knows what can and cannot be done. So, for example, on the Republican side, John McCain is also considered an expert in foreign relations, and he is a key member of the Foreign Relations Committee. He served in the military. He was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam era. So he has a lot of working knowledge and experience in foreign relations and foreign affairs. So if you want to run for Congress and your concern is tax relief, then the person still has to vote for complex issues such as Medicare, campaign finance reform, prescription drug benefits, welfare, not to mention dealing with foreign policy. So this is why when you get into Congress, you want to get on a committee that is important to your constituents so that you can show them you're working for them, bringing home the bacon, that pork barrel legislation we talked about, and that's very important for your reelection imperative. So getting assigned to a committee that your constituency cares about is very important. Another norm is seniority. Traditionally, of course, the majority party member with the longest continuous service on a particular committee is given the opportunity to chair that committee. So all the different committees in the House of Representatives, the chair of that committee is a Republican because the Republicans are the majority party in the Senate, in the House. So within those committees, all chair people are Republicans. How you get to be that chair is generally if you've served longest on that committee. So if you keep switching committees, you're never going to be the chair of that committee. Conversely, in the Senate, all the committees are chaired by Democrats because Democrats are the majority party. And so once a member of Congress is assigned to a committee, they're going to want to stay on that committee, and they can for as long as they wish. Weakness of this system is its inflexibility. Once a member was on a choice committee, his or her expertise becomes irrelevant. Okay? So if you're on a committee and you're no longer going to be, that issue is no longer as important in your constituency, if you switch committees, you're no longer going to have that seniority built up. However, since 1995, when House Republicans were the majority, they relied less on seniority and more on ideology and effectiveness to select committee chairs. So, again, seniority is important, division of labor is important, specialization is important, and of course, who is the majority makes a difference, because seats on committees are allocated to the proportion of the parties represented in the House and the Senate. So the majority in each chamber holds a corresponding majority on each committee. So again, it's important. That's why the different parties are striving to win the majority in the House and in the Senate. Because if you win the majority, you get to be the majority leader or the Speaker of the House. You get to have chair people on every committee be from your party. And your party gets to be the majority in every committee. So it's very important for the overall party to have the majority in each of the houses. All right, when we think about committees today, most of the work that Congress completes is done in the committees, and this is because of that division of labor and expertise. Woodrow Wilson wrote that Congress on the floor is Congress on public exhibition. Congress in committee is Congress at work. So he's arguing that when they're on the floor and they're talking about issues that you can see on C-SPAN, they're on public display. This is where they're making their case to the public. It's when they're in their committees that Congress is doing all the work. So in the committees, this is where they create hurdles that prevent bills from becoming laws. So most of the bills that originate out of committees are actually killed in committee. And committees are a useful way to kill legislation because individual members of Congress don't want credit for the killing of that particular bill. Why would Congress members introduce legislation that they don't want passed? And so for many people, even if they don't want that bill passed, they're going to suggest a bill because it's going to appease their constituency. But most of the time, it's easier to kill a bill than it is to pass one. 95% of all bills die in committee. All right, so there are a lot of rules that are assigned to the committee structure. There's lots of norms that help the committee structure run. And in the committees is where most of the work in terms of marking up the bill occurs. So let's talk about the different types of committees here. And things are a little bit out of order, so we'll just reveal all of these so it doesn't look so odd. Sorry about that. All right, committees are primarily divided into three important types. And then I've listed the fourth there, the joint committee. So these three different types of committees are your standing committees, your select committees, and your conference committees. So let's just take standing committees first. Standing committees are permanent committees with a fixed jurisdiction. So they're there from year to year to year, even after each Congress session and term is over. So each standing committee of the House and Senate has jurisdiction or authority over a particular policy area. So it could be the agricultural issue, foreign affairs, education, and each one of these standing committees have subcommittees. So there are approximately 20 members to each one of the permanent standing committees. And again, there's many of them. I've listed here three that are considered to be some of the most important, and these are the ones that exercise a great deal of influence in Congress and allow their members to leverage other members of Congress. And House rules define that these three committees are exclusive committees, and that means that members of Congress on these committees cannot sit on another committee. Okay, so if you're on the Appropriations Committee, that's the only one you're on. So the Appropriations Committee is one of the top three committees in Congress. This particular type of standing committee exists in both the House and the Senate, and the purpose of this committee is to determine how much money will actually be spent on each governmental activity and program. Appropriations means to spend. Okay. The Ways and Means Committee, and it's called the Budget Finance Committee in the Senate. Ways and means is simply describing how you're going to get money. What are the ways and means that you're going to get money so that this other committee, the Appropriation Committee, can spend it? So Ways and Means is a fancy way of saying taxes. So the Ways and Means Committee sets the tax rates and policies that determine the revenue available for the Appropriations Committee to spend. And then you have the Rules Committee. This determines which committee bills will come to the floor for final passage and under what circumstances. So the Rules Committee really controls the flow of committees in Congress. All right, so those are standing committees. They're permanent. They don't have to be reconstituted every term. Select, or what are called special committees, are created to perform a special, specific task. So these are established on a temporary basis to conduct investigations, for example, or study a specific problem. And usually they are addressing some hot topic button issue of the day. So they have no authority to propose bills. If they can offer suggestions, but all proposals have to come out of standing committees. And they must be reauthorized with each congressional term. So for example, after 9/11, there was a select committee on how to respond to terrorism, a select committee to deal with the anthrax scare, for example. Then we have conference committees. And conference committees are formed to work out differences between a House and a Senate version of a particular bill. In order for a piece of legislation to become law in this country, each the House and the Senate members have to vote on that particular bill. And each of these different bills coming out of the House and the Senate have to be alike. And so if there's differences about a particular issue that the House and Senate want to pass legislation on, a conference committee will be members from both the House and the Senate to work on some sort of an agreement about what this bill is going to look like. About 10 to 15% of bills end up in a conference committee. And then lastly, you have a joint committee, and this consists of members from both chambers that study broad areas of interest. And so it's much more broad than a special committee. So for example, a joint economic committee to study the effects of the recession, for example. So in most cases, the full House and Senate accept committee recommendations about passage of bills, although amendments to bills are quite common, and committees are careful to take other members of Congress into account when making legislative decisions. And these committees and these subcommittees are somewhat more important in the House than in the Senate, because remember, you have much more rules and so many more members in the House. All right, so those are the types of committees. This is a table that you'll find in your book just to show you these permanent committees of Congress. You might want to make a note if you've printed this out and take notes. These are the same as standing committees. So anytime you see permanent, you should think of standing. So these are House permanent committees, and you can see all the different issue areas ranging from agriculture to education to energy to Homeland Security, which is a relatively new committee, science and technology, Veterans Affairs, and you see the three that I talked about: appropriations, rules, and ways and means. And these are the corresponding permanent committees of the Senate, which may have different names, and they may have consolidated several topics into one because they have less members. So you can see back in the House where agriculture had its own policy, in the Senate it's agriculture, nutrition, and forestry. But they have an appropriations bill, they have a rules and administration bill, and then they have the tax office as well. All right, the Finance Committee. All right, we want to shift to talking about once all these organizations and structure and committees are created, what kind of powers does Congress have? And you have to recall what's written in the Constitution of Article 1, Section 8. Remember, they have enumerated powers. Those are the ones that are specifically spelled out in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 through 17. And then they have implied powers. That is the necessary and proper clause that's found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. So it's through these powers that they have the ability to act. So what is their functions? The major function, of course, is to enact legislation. And we'll talk a little bit about how they make decisions as Congresspeople on what to support. I've highlighted that because that's going to be the topic of Part 2B. So that'll be in the next lecture. So let me just say a few things about their other functions of oversight, advise and consent, and impeachment. All right. So in terms of what they have to do beyond their legislative duties is the power of oversight. And this is the ability to monitor or review the activities of the agencies and departments of the executive branch. And what they want to do is to make sure that the funding that they have spent and the laws that they have enacted are enforced. And so oversight is a congressional function of ensuring that the executive branch is carrying out their duties. Oversight is usually less rewarding than lawmaking or representation and receives correspondingly less attention from members of Congress. It is often awarded lowest priority and related to other functions. However, oversight is often pursued vigorously only when committee members are displeased with a particular agency or when a particular program requires major changes. Congress has the ability to restrain bureaucratic action, but sometimes it doesn't follow through because of what I've listed there. Sometimes they abuse their oversight powers for partisan purposes, so a lot of times you have Republicans during the Clinton administration doing all types of oversight committees in order to investigate the Clinton administration. You had Democrats doing the same thing during the Bush administration. And at the same time, sometimes even though Congress wants to investigate, witnesses are not going to cooperate. They're going to evade or simply not show up for testimony. All right, so that's the oversight function. One example is in 2006 when the Judiciary Committee was concerned about President Bush's authorization for surveillance, and so they held hearings on that particular program. And this is the former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales who was called to testify and explain before Congress what was going on. So that's an example of oversight. They also have the power to advise and consent. Now this is primarily and exclusively a Senate job. The House does not advise and consent. Senators are going to be that group that confirms all the appointments that the President makes in terms of federal judges, ambassadors, and people that have high executive jobs like his cabinet. And the Senate also approves all treaties. And then lastly, I just want to mention impeachment. Congress has the power to impeach either the executive or judges, federal judges, and remove them from office upon conviction by the Senate. So impeachment occurs if high officials are thought to have committed what are called treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The way this works is that the House acts as a grand jury, and a grand jury is simply the investigative part of the process. So the House acts as the investigative arm and brings the impeachment charges. It's the Senate that actually conducts the trial, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over that. So the House doesn't really do the trial. The House brings impeachment charges, and the Senate is where the trial is going to be conducted. And this simply is a rendition, a drawing of the trial of Andrew Johnson, who was one of the first presidents to be impeached back in right after the Civil War. All right, we're going to skip this slide for now. This is we've talked about this delegate or trustee, about the dilemma of whether or not the legislature is going to be a delegate or a trustee in terms of how they decide. So we'll mention this in the next lecture when we get to part 2B. All right, so we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and talk about how it is that a bill becomes a law and how do Congress members decide on whether they're going to support that bill or not.